let's see. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and do an intro. So as people are rolling in, I'll go ahead and just say welcome to everybody who can hear me, hopefully everybody, and see me, to our Zoom webinar, which is the first time that we've ever done an event through Zoom. We hope that you guys are all healthy and safe and at home and doing well in this time. We are really excited that we could be able to pilot some virtual programming for everybody in this period where we can't physically be in a space together. And just in case some of you are joining us from outside the DC area, my name is Raleigh Joyner. I'm the program coordinator at the Goethe-Institut German Cultural Center in Washington, DC. And today we're going to have a discussion of the first 2 episodes of season 1 of Babylon Berlin. We're really happy to be able to kick off our programming online this way. And we're so happy that the RSVPs and the response to this were very positive. And we're hoping to do more virtual offerings in the coming weeks and months. And so just a little bit of info before I hand this over to Dr. Baer. Just so that you know how the online event is going to work. I'll just run through the basics of a Zoom room, or how our Zoom room is going to sort of be set up. So this is a Zoom webinar versus a Zoom meeting. So all participants have had their microphones, cameras, and their screen sharing disabled upon entering. For this event, we also have disabled the chat feature so that we can streamline the comments into the Q&A feature, which you'll find at the bottom of our faces as we talk. After Dr. Baer's intro and her presentation, we're going to allow hand raise function as well, which we use when participants want to speak, and then they get unmuted and then remuted when they're done. So the difference between that is sort of that Q&A. It's sort of what we encourage people to present new ideas and questions with the Q&A, and then responses you can use with the hand raise feature. So in the first minutes of the event, we're going to have just Dr. Baer's presentation, and then we'll open it up to discussion. And also, you know, just for the sake of time and for the sake of making sure that everybody who wants to share a thought can share it in the time that we have. We just encourage everybody to keep notes and yeah, and sort of streamline their response so that we can make it around the group and make sure everybody has something to say if they want to. So yeah. Once again, thank you all for coming, and I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Dr. Baer, who's a professor of Germanic studies, film studies, and also women's studies over at the University of Maryland. She has taught quite a bit about film in the past, and the era of 1920s Berlin is one of the biggest things I would say in her wheelhouse. So I would say that this group is in very good hands. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to her. And I'm going to mute myself.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And I just wanted to let you know that I'm coming to you from my house in Silver Spring, Maryland right now. I can't see any of you, but I know there are some familiar faces out there. And I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and thoughts. We're focusing tonight on the first 2 episodes of Babylon Berlin. And I just wanted to say at the beginning that in the hopes that we might have some more of these conversations down the road, if all goes well tonight, I'm gonna avoid spoilers about the remaining parts of season 1 or seasons 2 and 3. I mean, I will reference them a little bit, but try to avoid a little bit talking too much about where the series goes from there. So just wanted to put that out there at the beginning. I also wanted to say that I was super pleased when Raleigh approached me about having this discussion, because I'm a big fan of Babylon Berlin, and I'm expressing my fandom tonight with my 20s era costume as best as I could put it together. It also has the advantage of covering up my quarantine hair. So I hope you appreciate my hat tonight. So I started out by talking about my admiration for the show because I really think that Babylon Berlin is a feat of filmmaking with its mammoth scale, its high production values, and its really careful attention to detail. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what went into the making of the series and give you some background about that in a moment. But I just want to start by saying what I really find most intriguing about the show is its approach to presenting history and the culture of the Weimar era. Uli Hanich, who's the main set designer for Babylon Berlin, has said that the showrunners were not at all interested in what he called a museum gaze, a museum-like approach to the period of Weimar, but rather they very deliberately took liberties in order to emphasize the resonances between the 1920s and the present day. And I really think that they succeed in representing the promises and the perils of Weimar without unduly romanticizing the era. They refuse to fetishize authenticity in depicting history. And I think that that opens up ways for us to think about what might have been otherwise or what could have transpired differently in the 20s and beyond if the developments taking place in Weimar had not been foreclosed upon by National Socialism. But at the same time, the show really doesn't hold back in showing how messy Weimar was. I think there's a real emphasis in the show on the fragility of democracy in this period and this pervasive sense of precarity and insecurity, uncertainty that might resonate for viewers at present. And I think the showrunners very much had that in mind in making the show. And the show really doesn't shy away from looking a little bit also as it develops over 3 seasons at the origins of the roots of Nazism in the social, economic, and political conflicts of the Weimar period. And I read a few interviews with the showrunners, Tykwer, Achim von Borries, and Handloegten, who three men who co-wrote and co-directed the series together. And they said that they originally wanted to make a show set in the 1920s because they felt that the Weimar era was not adequately represented in the audiovisual culture of the contemporary period, in contrast to Nazism, which is very ubiquitous. Tykwer has said of contemporary German film and television, Hitler is our big star. But at the same time, in most German films that focus on the Nazi past, the Nazis are really depicted as others. And in contrast, the showrunners of Babylon Berlin wanted to make a show that explores this topic a little bit differently. Tykwer says, we don't show a couple of evil guys who turn out to be Nazis. Rather, they wanted to show how in just a few years, all of the characters and institutions that are represented in the show will be part of the Third Reich. Most will have accommodated themselves to the regime or become card-carrying Nazis, and others will have fallen victim to the Nazis, although I will say that I think one shortcoming of the show is that it really doesn't delve into Jewish life in Berlin in the 1920s. So we'll return to history in a moment, and I'm hoping that you all will have some comments and questions about that. But I wanted to first set the scene with a little bit of background about the production and reception history of the show. And I have some slides, so bear with me just for a moment while I click over to that. And for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to show you some images that will help talk about the background and the kind of aesthetic construction of the show. And I'll end with a clip, and then we'll open it up to your comments and questions, and hopefully a broader discussion. Okay, so here we go. Okay, does everyone see, can you see my slides now, Raleigh?
I do, yeah.
Okay, so that's working, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, so I just wanted to start out by talking a little bit about the background of the show. So Babylon Berlin is an adaptation of the best-selling detective novels by Volker Kutscher. Seasons 1 and 2 of the series both draw on Kutscher's first novel, the first Germanic novel, which was published in German in 2008, called Der nasse Fisch, or the wet fish, which is a German phrase referring to cold cases or unsolved crimes. And that novel was translated into English as Babylon Berlin, appearing in translation in 2018. Volker Kutscher has said that in writing the series, he was inspired by contemporary serial television, especially The Sopranos. And so you see a kind of a feedback loop here, as well as by Fritz Lang's classic Weimar film, M, from 1931. And the novels, in a way, read like mashups that combine kind of familiar generic tropes and expectations from contemporary crime fiction with a deep dive into the Weimar underworld. And Kutscher really researched a lot about cops and robbers, essentially, in the Weimar period. And the book's popularity, they were huge bestsellers in Germany, also derives from the way that they use settings that are very familiar from today's Berlin. So it's a kind of virtual tourism into the past that relies very much on markers from the present. And I think this kind of carries over into the show as well. For instance, the first novel, Der nasse Fisch, or translated as Babylon Berlin, takes place around Hermannplatz in the Neukölln neighborhood of Berlin. And it uses the original construction of what is now the Karstadt department store that may be familiar to a lot of people as a backdrop to the action. So clearly the novels are really ripe in a way for adaptation as a series. And in fact, I would say they were probably really written with the idea of being sold for adaptation in mind. The director Tom Tykwer, very well-known German director, initially seized on the idea of developing this adaptation, which he proposed to X-Filme Creative Pool, the company that he had co-founded in 1994 as a German production company with a long tradition of creating successful German language films for the international market, beginning at least with the breakthrough hit Lola Rennt, Run, Lola, Run from 1998, which Tom Tykwer also wrote and directed, and which, like Babylon Berlin, similarly focuses on the kinetic movement of a young woman through the city. And the slide here shows Lola from Run, Lola, Run, which most of you are probably familiar with, the 1998 film. And I think despite the large historical gulf between the two characters, these two women really share a lot in common as protagonists of films set in Berlin. So X-Filme pursues an integrated production model, meaning that it shepherds its own productions from development as story ideas all the way through the shooting, marketing, and into distribution. And it's long taken a pioneering role in developing new technologies and formats that can help it realize this goal of creating what it calls smart films that people want to see. And in the case of Babylon Berlin, the company spearheaded, and I think this is a very interesting backdrop, an innovative public-private partnership model to fund the series, something that had never been done before in German television. So the series was co-produced by the German public television station ARD, together with the private subscription channel Sky TV, and a brand new federal subvention program through the German government that was created specifically for financing Babylon Berlin to support the creation of internationally marketable prestige television series. And the idea behind this subvention scheme, which has now gone on to support some other German series, including, I believe, the Netflix series Dark, is that it's television made and set in Germany and shot in the German language that can compete with the ubiquity of Hollywood-produced international film and television productions. So through this combination of public and private funds, X-Filme, the production company, secured 40 million euros, or about $45 million, as a budget for the first 2 seasons of Babylon Berlin. And they shot these first 16 episodes, 8 episodes in season 1 and 8 episodes in season 2. And they shot them all at once and distributed them together. And this 40 million euro budget makes Babylon Berlin the most expensive German language television series ever made, and also the most expensive non-English language series of all time. But the gambit seems to have paid off, as the series was immensely popular in Germany, where it first debuted on the private subscription service Sky TV, where it did very well, and then it played on the public television station ARD, the first channel, where it had an amazing 25% market share, meaning it was seen simultaneously by millions and millions of people. And then it was sold to 90 countries and territories around the world, where it's been very positively reviewed and received. So why was it so expensive to make this show? The lavish budget underwrote 185 days of shooting. They shot these first two seasons of the series for a period of 7 months, with just a few days off in that period. They had a cast of 400 actors, and estimates range between 5,000 and 7,000 extras. And many of the 400 main actors in the show were prominent German actors of stage and screen. Approximately 70% of the show was shot on location in Berlin, and the show was also able to take advantage of a brand new set that was being built at the studio Babelsberg near Potsdam outside of Berlin, one of Germany's biggest film studios. And they were planning to build anyway a new set called the Neue Berliner Straße, the New Berlin Street, which would provide a shooting set for films set in Berlin. And since they were planning to build that anyway, Babylon Berlin was able to sort of give them specifications for building this set. And that was a very important aspect of the film's production. And using this set and the shooting locations around the city of Berlin allowed the filmmakers to generally avoid using CGI and digital effects, which are so common for settings of other film and television productions these days. And I think that's a really interesting part of the show that maybe we can talk about a little bit more. And in a moment, I have some images to show you sort of what that looks like. The CGI and digital effects were used sometimes in the show to make big crowds, and also to add stories to buildings, because a lot of the areas where they found good buildings, the buildings were too short, which I thought was kind of interesting. So because they prioritized location shoots for the series, the showrunners, and you see an image of the three here, employed a somewhat unusual model for filming Babylon Berlin. So Tykwer, Borries, and Handloegten co-wrote the scripts together, and all three directed on a rotating basis together with 3 cinematographers. And they shot scenes for all 16 episodes of seasons 1 and 2 on a location by location basis. For instance, all scenes taking place in the Mocha FD nightclub were shot at once during a few days period. And then they only put the full series together later in the editing room after the whole 7-month shoot was over. And this way of proceeding made it possible for them to take advantage of unusual shooting locations. For instance, they were able to shoot a number of scenes at Alexanderplatz in Berlin, which is a real rarity because it's such a hub that it's rarely approved for people to shoot on location there. But it also meant that the actors never really had a sense of the show's broader narrative or their own character arcs, which fostered an immersion in each moment for the actors, whatever scene they were shooting on that particular day was what they were focused on. And I think in a way it helps to convey a sense of uncertainty, this kind of uncertainty that pervades the show. And it's interesting to listen to the actors speak about what that process was like, of acting in the moment without really understanding how a given scene fit into the larger narrative of the show. And these location shots were really important to the series, I think, since Berlin, whose nickname the Whore of Babylon derived from its reputation for sexual emancipation and lawlessness in the early part of the 20th century, Berlin features as a key protagonist, obviously, in the show. And the show's visual language, I think, remixes familiar images of Berlin from the 1920s together with contemporary associations with the city. And I think a lot of its fascination and pleasure in watching derives from this kind of mixing together. And I've got a few examples to show you what I have in mind. So a very big influence on the visual language of the film was the filmmaker Walter Ruttmann, especially his film Berlin Symphonie einer Großstadt from 1927. Also, you'll see in the final credit sequences of many of the episodes, including episodes 1 and 2, you will see avant-garde films that Ruttmann made, abstract films he made in the 1920s. I think Opus 4 and Opus 2 are the films that are shown during the final credit sequences that Ruttmann made. And his depictions of street life in Berlin were very important for the visual language set up by the filmmakers of Babylon Berlin. And I think it's also interesting that Ruttmann went on to be an assistant director and cameraman for Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. So he's also the kind of figure who crossed from being an exemplar of Weimar modernity into being someone who really accommodated himself with National Socialism and with the Nazi film industry later on. And here is an image of Alexanderplatz, one of those shoots on Alexanderplatz that was made possible. They evacuated the whole square for that a 12-hour period so the filmmakers could shoot there, and you can see a little the resonance of this kind of image of Berlin from the 20s that they were looking at in developing the mise-en-scène here. Another really important film for Babylon Berlin as an intertext or reference point is the film Menschen am Sonntag, People on Sunday from 1930, directed by Robert Siodmak and Edgar Ulmer and co-written by Billy Wilder, who obviously then left Germany for Hollywood exile soon thereafter. And as the season progresses, season 1 of Babylon Berlin, there are a couple of episodes that explicitly show characters watching this film, People on Sunday, and a couple of scenes where the visual vocabulary is very predominantly taken from the film. So if this period interests you, I can strongly, strongly recommend watching Menschen am Sonntag. It's a wonderful, wonderful film, and also one that's very interesting to view in tandem with Babylon Berlin. And here is a scene shot in the subway station at Hermannplatz, where the characters return several times in the course of Babylon Berlin. A scene here, as you can see, if you're familiar with this part of Berlin, that they barely manipulated. It looks almost the same as it does in the present day. And an example of this kind of remixing of Weimar signifiers into present day reality. Another important reference point for the filmmakers of Babylon Berlin was Fritz Lang's M. This was also a film that strongly influenced the novel by Volker Kutscher that was the basis for the adaptation. And you can see here the inspector, Lohmann from Fritz Lang's M, who was a model actually for Ernst Gehnert, a historical figure who was actually the head of the criminal police in Berlin in the 20s, was the model both for Inspector Lohmann in Lang's M and is a character in Babylon Berlin. I think physically there's a great resemblance also between Lohmann and Inspector Wolter, Kommissar Bruno Wolter, who is Rat's partner in season 1 here. If we come back and reconvene, I would talk a little bit more about Neue Sachlichkeit, or the new objectivity, which was a very important aesthetic movement in Weimar Berlin, and I think really influenced a lot of the visual vocabulary of Babylon Berlin. But Weimar Expressionism is also definitely on view here. We see, for instance, the scenes in the nightclub from Fritz Lang's Metropolis here are very resonant with the way the Mocha Efti looks in Babylon Berlin. And I also wanted to just give you an image from Berghain, Berlin's contemporary most famous nightclub, techno club, because I think there's also, again, an example here of the way the kind of remixing of familiar signifiers from contemporary Berlin with the older images works. And I found this image from a making of documentary about the show, and these were photos that were used by the costumers and makeup artists to work on the presentation of the actors to make them look Weimar-like. And I think it's quite interesting to see how photography and film play not only in the visual construction of Babylon Berlin, but also in sort of the broader narrative that's developed by the show. And I wanted to give some examples of that. So Weimar was a period when film and photography started to really first emerge in Germany as significant cultural forces. And this emphasis on the surface culture, visual culture, raised a lot of questions about the epistemological status or truth value of visual images and their influence on individual and mass psychology. And narratives of Weimar films especially abound with hypnosis, with the doppelganger or the double, with stories about losing control of one's body or one's agency. And I think we see a lot of this resonating also in Babylon Berlin. Raleigh, I put this in there especially for you. Babylon Berlin begins with a sequence in which Gerion Rath, in the very first episode, is hypnotized. He's put into a hypnotic trance, and we see a montage of images that we can only later realize come from the entire first season. And here's Gerion Rath, and I found that very resonant, the way this image of him in hypnosis connects to the image of the somnambulist Cesare in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. In his book From Caligari to Hitler, Siegfried Kracauer, the German Jewish film critic, very famously reads Caligari as a premonition of Hitler, a character who, quote, uses hypnotic power to force his will upon his tool being the somnambulist Cesare, who we just saw a picture of, a technique foreshadowing in content and purpose that manipulation of the soul, which Hitler was the first to practice on a gigantic scale. So that's Kracauer writing about the way we can see in Weimar cinema motifs that anticipate the coming political events in Germany. And here you see an image of Cesare on the rooftop carrying out Caligari's murderous intentions. And I thought the rooftop chase scene, which we see over and over in Weimar cinema, is also a trope that is developed right at the outset of season 1, when Gerion Rath is chasing Krajewski over the rooftops. You see that here. And this image of sort of the hands, the body parts out of control is taken up very prominently in many Weimar films. This is another film by Robert Wiener, the director of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Orlach's Hände, The Hands of Orlach from 1924, where a concert pianist loses control of his hands. He has to have someone else's hands implanted on him so that he can keep playing, but then those hands start to carry out acts that he doesn't have any agency over. And the motif of shaking hands and a body that one can't control is prominently featured also throughout Babylon Berlin, in part through the story of Gerion Rath's own war trauma and his morphine addiction, which comes up a lot in the first couple of episodes. German film historian Anton Case has described the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and other Weimar films as exemplary of shell-shock cinema. In contrast to Krakauer's prospective reading of Weimar cinema, he develops this retrospective reading, analyzing characters like Cesare as metaphorical representations of war trauma. And in Babylon Berlin, we see, for instance, the depiction of war veterans, World War I veterans, not just in the case of Gerhard Rath himself, but also regularly as part of the cityscape. And this was one image that really caught my eye because Voltaire says of these men, they are kaputte Automaten, or broken automatons. At other point, he calls them, I think Krajewski, who's also a war veteran, he refers to as a zitterer, a trembler, very negatively. And I think it's interesting to think about these two approaches to Weimar cinema. In a way, Babylon Berlin can be said to exemplify both approaches, depicting the figure of the double or the doppelganger, the automaton, the hypnotized, shell-shocked, or drug-dependent character as a result of war trauma, but also in possession of a nascent kind of violence that is about to combust. In shell-shock cinema, Case understands the flourishing of cinema in the Weimar era really as a response to World War I. He writes, sharpened by the war's assault on sight and sound, post-war films addressed questions of perception. They focused on the medium-specific difficulty of distinguishing between the record of visible reality and the subjective vision that necessarily distorts it. And we can see in Babylon Berlin also this emphasis on perception, subjectivity, and truth as an abiding preoccupation of the series. And we see that, I think, especially in the really interesting engagement with film and photography as sites of evidence in the crime story that the show develops. We see stories about doppelganger and narratives about perception and truth that emphasize how Weimar Berlin was both a laboratory of modernity and a breeding ground for fascism. And I think the depiction of film and photography in the show is really at the crux of that double aspect of the Weimar period itself. And I just had a couple of screen grabs that depict aspects of that focus. We see the photographs, and then we see the film strips, and then we see this one single frame of a film that is the sought after piece of evidence, interestingly depicting ostensibly Konrad Adenauer, the future Chancellor of West Germany, in some kind of BDSM situation. At least this image without a head is what's being used to blackmail Adenauer, and the cause of Rath's secret transfer to Berlin to find the origins of the film. And a lot of looking at images, looking at photographs. And there's a very interesting sequence also where Lotte and Rath run into each other, and the kind of porny images from the morality police get jumbled up with the images of dead bodies that Lotte is trying to archive. And later on, Rath accidentally or on purpose includes one of the images of dead bodies in the set of dirty postcards that he passes to his pharmacist who gives him morphium. And I'm drawing to a close here. There's one other way in which I think doubling or double lives figure interestingly in Babylon Berlin, and that's in regard to gender and sexuality. And this is a topic that comes up a lot more prominently in later episodes of the season that we can maybe return to talking about if we have another discussion. of later episodes, but I wanted to just show some images of the new woman, who was such an important kind of discursive figure during the Weimar period, an ambivalent construct through which the culture was coming to terms with women's emancipation and with the broader kind of changing, transforming gender and sexual roles in modern society at the period. And I just pulled up a couple of images that show the way that this figure, the new woman, was depicted during the Weimar era. Some paintings by Otto Dix and Christian Schad. Another Christian Schad painting. Here's a photograph of a new woman from a fashion magazine with a bob haircut, short hair, featuring prominently in Babylon Berlin, and a new exciting fashion style at the time. Some further images that demonstrate the changing sexual and gender roles of the period from the lesbian magazine Die Freundin, and the artist Jean Mamen drawing fashion images that show women really departing from conventions of femininity that had ruled up until that time. And a final slide that shows some further images of the new woman boxing topless, and Josephine Baker, who is very prominently referenced in the sequence that we're going to look at in a second. And I think this part, the portrayal of gender and sexuality, is one of the really interesting aspects of the show that engages anachronism. Anachronism, not in the sense of sort of historically inaccurate documentary things, but in the sense of bringing the present into dialogue with the past. And I think this sequence where Lotte can't find a women's bathroom is a great example that connects the contemporary conversations about bathrooms with the changing gender roles in the Weimar period. And of course, we also have the cross-dressing or androgynous or drag king. People have talked about this character in different ways. Svetlana / Nikoros, who performs at the Mocha FT in this very interesting sequence that I would like to look at. And I'm going to click out of the slides and into the clip really quick. I wanted to show this clip because I do think it really stands out in the first 2 episodes as one of the most interesting clips, but also it really exemplifies this idea of thinking through the aesthetic influence of Weimar on later cultural moments and developments, and sort of filtering back the representation of Weimar through more contemporary things. And the music director of the series, Babylon Berlin, has said that the direction he got in beginning to write this song, Von Asche zu Staub, was if Frankie Goes to Hollywood's song Relax were played in 1929, what would that sound like?
All right.
So that was Relax by Frankie Goes to Hollywood, how it sounded in 1929, apparently. Yeah. But I do think it's quite interesting how it resonates with, other later figures, musical figures who are connected to Berlin, also people like David Bowie, or also Brian Ferry, who has a song in episode 2 and who later has a cameo in the show. So there's a interesting play with these kind of signifiers and tropes that we connect with Weimar, that kind of puts the present and past into dialogue. And I think for me, this is one of the really interesting parts of the show.
Great. Well, thanks a lot to Dr. Baer for her presentation. And now we are going to go ahead and turn it over to Q&A. So just as a reminder of how that works, to start like a new question or point that you would like to make, please submit to Q&A. And then the hand raise function we would like to use for responding further to the same topic. So yeah, hand raising is for like staying on the same track, and then Q&A is for sort of shifting gears into a new zone, a new area of conversation. So I'm going to go ahead and open this, and I'm going to go ahead and read some. All right. So I'll start with this question from Elena. So she says, thanks so much for doing this talk. I have two questions. Number one, the accents are really interesting in this show. Lotta's Ika pronunciation of ich, and throughout the brothel characters. Does this reflect anything about the accents of the time in addition to Berlin's specific dialect? And number two, can you speak to the decision to use Adenauer in such a specific and scandalous setting?
Oh, great questions. Yes, the Ika is a Berlin dialect, and I think and it still is Berlin dialect, that pronunciation, but even today. But I think in the context of the Weimar period, it is definitely working class. It marks Lotta as a working class person. It shows her background that we also see in the show with the portrayal of her large family living together in a small tenement apartment under very insecure circumstances, and the poverty of that family that is also developed a lot over the seasons of the show. So yes, I think it's an important observation that you made. Thank you for that. And the second question, about the use of Adenauer. Yeah, I think, I mean, Adenauer obviously is an iconographic person in German history, also as a conservative politician who's very much associated with the restoration of Germany in the post-World War II period, when he was known, I think his nickname was Opa, Grandpa, as a prominent politician who really led post-war West Germany on its kind of conservative path in the post-war period. So I think it's a very ironic choice. This is also something that you can find in the novel, Der nasse Fisch, the novel that was translated as Babylon Berlin by Volker Kutscher. This plot line about Konrad Adenauer is already present in the novel, and I view that as a very ironic choice of the novelist and also the filmmakers to put Adenauer in this position, kind of speaking to the false morality or double morality of post-war society that really chose to continue foreclosing upon Weimar modernity, for instance, by not renewing a lot of the liberalized laws from the Weimar period, instead really insisting on conservative politics when it came to gender and sexuality, among many other things.
So we have actually two folks, Antonio and Katrin have both brought up the role of the Trotskyite group in the first two episodes. And so they've both asked, what is the role of the Trotskyite group in this particular setting, and also in that general time period, and sort of the relation maybe of the plot and possibly the story of Luxembourg and Liebknecht. And was there a connection between those events that happened with those two and the Trotsky group, and where was sort of the far left in Berlin at this time?
So, great question. Episode 1 begins, I think I got it wrong in the questions that were circulated, but it begins on April 29th and ends on April 30th. It's, in any case, it's on the eve of May 1st, 1929, which went down in history as Bloody May Day, and the whole month of May 1929 in Berlin particularly was characterized by huge street battles, and we see this in the course of season 1, between the Social Democrat-led police department of Berlin and communist fraction groups, and the police were essentially murdering communists in the streets, and the police, you know, were social democrats, so they were centrist in that regard, but left-leaning. So this was part of this kind of factionalism and political social conflict, even among people, you know, left of center, shall we say, that is so important for understanding the historical developments in Germany in the 1930s subsequently. This particular storyline about the Trotskyites, I think, is is fabricated for sure. I mean, as far as I know, Trotsky was in exile in Turkey in this period, and the plot line suggests that the Trotskyite group is trying to smuggle gold from that, on that train car from Soviet Russia to Berlin in order to then further get that gold to Trotsky to support him in exile. I don't think that there's any, you know, historical ground for this particular kind of narrative plotline. It's fictionalized, fabricated, and there's a lot of nitpicky stuff that you can read online about the historical inaccuracies of the series. And I say nitpicky because I don't think the series aspires to really portray history as it developed. It definitely uses broad strokes in this regard. But I think the idea of using the Trotskyite group here is more as kind of shorthand for this factionalism that's taking place in Berlin at the time. Did I answer the question? More or less.
So,
okay.
I mean,
kind of last track.
maybe if anybody's not familiar with Luxembourg and Liebknecht, you can sort of explain what that was. Yeah, and I'm not sure why the filmmakers or the writer before that, because I think this Trotsky group was also part of the novel. I'm not sure why they chose a Trotskyite group as the fraction to depict in this part of the series, but they seem to shy away from depicting more prominent historical figures, such as the communist leaders of the actual Communist Party of Germany at the time, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who were important figures at this time, although now I'm struggling with my historical dates a little bit in terms of remembering exactly when they were murdered. I think it was like 19, I don't want to say something wrong. I want to say 1919.
Earlier, yeah. So not figures at this time. Sorry, a little foggy on my history of the German left in the post World War I era. Sorry about that. Yes. So they had been the communist leaders in the early post-war period when the abortive German Revolution took place, and then I think were murdered by the Freikorps, the right-wing soldiers in Berlin at the time. But certainly throughout the 20s, sectionalist groups of all sorts were very active politically in Berlin and were fighting for recognition and for, you know, still throughout the 20s for the idea of a socialist or a communist revolution in Germany. So the show is engaging with this history without depicting it in the most accurate way, I would say, or any kind of like historically documentary type way. Yeah.
And also, I just thought I would throw this in the pot for people maybe who are not familiar with Berlin and maybe like the street names or just the general landscape of Berlin. But, you know, after World War II, when the GDR was established, which was communist, and very much those figures sort of came back from Weimar, the Weimar era, and their names, you can see them all over the place when you go to the parts of the former East Berlin. There is near Alexanderplatz, which was the large square that they filmed in. You can see nearby, within walking distance, there is a Karl Liebknecht Straße, there is a Rosa Luxemburg Straße, there is also a Karl Marx Straße. There are a number of streets and places in Berlin that are named after these big names of the left and of communist socialist ideology. And when Germany reunited, these names haven't changed. It's still Rosa Luxemburg Straße, it's still Karl Liebknecht Straße. So that's also kind of an interesting, I thought, way that history is still being reflected the way if you go to Berlin today and look at that. So I have a question here from Virginia about sort of the role of religion in the show, especially Gerayon's. So why did Lotta ask if Gerayon was from the Middle Ages? I think that has to do with that name being very or kind of antiquated name. And then also she asks, there is more than one mention of him being Catholic, and what is sort of the significance of him being a Catholic in this time period, in this setting?
Good question. So yes, I think her question about whether he's from the Middle Ages is simply that he has a very unusual name that has a kind of antiquated quality to it. And in terms of his Catholicism, so Cologne was a Catholic stronghold at this time, and I'm not exactly sure. I think in part the association of Catholicism with certain political leanings was pretty strong at this time, and Adenauer himself, I believe, was he at the time was a mayor. At the time that the story takes place, was a mayor of Cologne, who was a representative of the Catholic Center Party. So I think that there's an association of Gerion Rath also politically with a more conservative leaning party that is connected to his religious beliefs. So I think she's just trying to learn about him, but also maybe trying to learn about what his politics are and how that might connect to her own aspirations as a person who's kind of working with him, a person of a working class background and a woman, to gain employment in the police service and to work closer with him and get him on her side. So I think that's part of what's going on with that line of questioning.
And also, sort of maybe going off of the idea of Gerion as a Catholic, you mentioned in your introductory presentation that the show it comes up very short when it comes to representing Jewish life in Berlin. And Yuen has asked the question, how intentional was the decision on the part of the showrunners to not include much depiction of Jewish life in the time period? So like, there was such a huge Jewish population in Berlin. Why are they not so visible in the show?
Yeah, I think it must have been intentional. I mean, all choices are deliberate ones, right, when making art in some way. And I'm not sure how to explain it. I haven't found too much discussion of this topic in interviews with the creators. For myself, I found it to be an oversight of the show. I mean, there is the social democratic character Benda, who shows up, I think, for the first time in episode 2. He plays an important role in the narrative of this season. And Benda is Jewish and also a police president. So there is that character, and then there is Kattelbach, who is a tenant at the apartment that Rat also rents a room in from the landlady Elisabeth Benke. And the Kattelbach character, he's a journalist who's from Vienna originally, working in Berlin. He's also a Jewish character, and his character comes back in later seasons as well. But those are really the only two somewhat developed characters who are Jewish in the show, as far as I can recall at this point, and really limit the show's ability to engage in any substantive fashion with Jewish life in Berlin at this time, which was, of course, very, very significant, very important, also intellectually and aesthetically. And so it's interesting, I think, that the show doesn't choose to pursue that path more. And maybe it has to do with what I was talking about earlier, this interest that the showrunners really had in trying to focus on characters who were going to become Nazis or become accommodated with the regime later, to focus on characters, you know, this idea that they didn't want to depict Nazis as others. Their idea is to continue making episodes of the show. I think it's slowed down in the timeline substantially, because by season 3 they're still in 1929. So at this rate, it's going to take them a while to get to 1933. But I think their idea, at least initially, was to carry the show through the transition to National Socialism in Germany, and therefore to show actually what happens to all of these main characters and how they do become part of the regime, either accommodating themselves with the regime or actually becoming convinced Nazis themselves. So that is part of their idea. And so maybe what they wanted to do was really just to focus more on these characters who would end up becoming Nazis eventually. But I'm not sure that that still justifies in a show that really depicts so many aspects of the kind of totality of Weimar Berlin, to kind of overlook this really significant part of it, I think is a poor choice.
And one guest has pointed out that at the beginning scene, or the scene on Alexanderplatz, you do see several Orthodox Jewish people in Orthodox clothing, shown very briefly in passing. So it sounds to me like they were present just a little bit, like in the landscape. But what I feel like the show has sort of missed out on is that Berlin was so filled with, had such a huge population of Jewish people, in contrast to post-Holocaust Berlin, where there is, Berlin became and is now such a secular city, but the utter lack of Jewish community in Berlin now compared to the way it was before the war. I think if they had at least just shown that a little bit more, it would have certainly upped that contrast a little bit more for especially people who know Berlin and know that how awfully the community was decimated at that time.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, and I mean, there are a couple of times, you're absolutely right. The commenter is absolutely right. There are a couple of times in the show when we see Hasidic Jews, you know, but it's always just kind of in the background or in passing.
So Linda has posed a question about sort of the role of the gangsters and like the organized crime units, and she said, to what extent is it accurate that the gangsters were in such control, and would there have been an Armenian man running a mafia-style gang in that way, or was that sort of some creative license that they're taking in the creation of the show?
Yeah, interesting question. Yes, the gangsters did rule a lot of Berlin at the time. There was a super active kind of mafia scene with competing gangs in Berlin at the time. And the author, Volker Kutscher, really focuses on the gang activity in the novels. And he did a lot of research into this history in order to depict it, you know, fairly accurately. So I personally don't know a huge amount about the history of this, but I have read that that he did really good, you know, accurate research into it. And I don't know if the Armenian man is poetic license. I mean, certainly Berlin was an extremely multicultural place, and there were a lot of Russians in the mafia, I know as well at the time. And so the character, the Armenian, figures very importantly in the show. And some of, I recently watched season 3 of Babylon Berlin, and I noticed that some things that happen in the first 2 episodes circle back in season 3 in a really important way, including things that involve the Armenian. So I think that's a very interesting character. I love the actor who's played in a lot of German crime shows and in films as well. I think he's just a great character actor, and not sure about the historical accuracy of his ethnicity here, but I wouldn't be surprised.
So Christy has posed the question. There was a quote from episode 1, Berlin's streets are rougher than anywhere else in the Reich. She says, why do you think this is? And also, I guess to build on that, like, it's very well established that Berlin is a lawless city here, even though we're looking at this story from the point of view of somebody who works for the law. It's still lawless. But also, yeah, I mean, why in particular Berlin, whereas other big cities in Germany, Cologne or Munich, why are they not like this? What's wrong with Berlin?
You know, I had the one image of the pillar where there's a close-up in the episode on the pillar that says, you know, Berlin, Weltstadt, everyone's got to come here at some point. And there's a history of Berlin being viewed as exceptional within Germany, as a city that is really unlike any other German city, for geographical reasons, for historical, political reasons. And I think the 20s epitomizes that exceptionalism of Berlin within Germany, you know, maybe also in addition to the era of the Berlin Wall, which certainly underscored Berlin's exceptionalism again. The political, I mean, other German cities were not immune to the political strife that characterized Berlin during this time. Munich, for instance, also saw street battles, but other cities tended to be more homogeneous than Berlin, to have smaller surface areas than Berlin, and therefore to not see the level of kind of political conflict that was happening in Berlin at the time. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but I think Berlin was always known for this kind of licentiousness, for this kind of very liberal culture when it came to art, to sexuality, and also to sort of the ability of people to operate outside of the law, let's say. And at this time, you know, as the show demonstrates, there was rampant drug use going on in the populace, and this was certainly not only taking place in Berlin, but Berlin was a center also as a dense and large urban area for drug use, and it had this very developed nightlife culture also as the capital that was important for this as well. So Joseph has asked, can you speak to the show's use of interwar literature? I keep thinking I'm seeing faint allusions to Berlin Alexanderplatz, which for anybody who's not familiar is a novel from Alfred Döblin, which is a very, what's the word? Very representative of Weimar Berlin. In its similarly sprawling view of the city and the way that different crowds like gangsters and Nazis keep bumping into each other. So, yeah, great point about Berlin Alexanderplatz. I think the show, I focused in my presentation on the way that the show resonates with film in particular. I think, you know, as we move forward, we could definitely talk a lot more about its references to literature, which are very many. And Berlin Alexanderplatz is a great example. There's tons of references to Berlin Alexanderplatz, the Döblin novel, and also to the Fassbinder miniseries from 1980, which was a big inspiration for the visual style of the show as well. And we'll see that coming up if anyone's familiar with Fassbinder's series. It's a multi-part mini-series adaptation of Döblin's novel that Fassbinder made not too long before he died. And as a series, it was also very influential on the thinking around Babylon Berlin, because television series, mini-series like that weren't so common at the time that Fassbinder made this one as they are currently. So yes, Berlin Alexanderplatz, both the novel and the later Fassbinder adaptation, and we see multiple references to many other novels and texts about Berlin of Joseph Roth, for example, are referenced here. The novels of Irmgard Coin, especially Das Kunstseidene Mädchen, the artificial silk girl, and Gilgi, eine von uns, are referenced regularly, and there's a couple of scenes I think later on in this season or in the next that really come almost straight out of the Coin novels. And aspects of Lotta's characterization, I think, are taken more from the Coin novels than they are from actually the depiction of the character in Kutscher's Gary and Rat series, where the Charlotte Ritter character is portrayed completely differently in the novels than she is in this show. And I think the show takes a lot of her characterization from literature, interwar literature, especially the text of Irmgard Coin, which I can highly recommend to you to read if you are not familiar with those. And I think the Artificial Silk Girl is pretty easily available in English translation as well.
Yeah, I think we should post conversation. We could drop a little list of the things you've referenced. Especially somebody asked about the movie Menschen am Sonntag. So some of the things that you brought up, I can send everybody a list of the things that you mentioned. And we do have a raised hand from Andrew, so I'm going to click allow to talk.
Okay.
Andrew, you're live.
We can't hear you, so you might need to unmute yourself.
You might need to unmute. All right, well, we'll get back to you if you want to hit me up in the Q&A. But for now, we'll go over to another question. Antonio asks, hyperinflation was dealt with by 1923 or 24, and I thought that the economy was in a better shape, rising living standards in Berlin compared to the post-war, but the slum where Lotta lives indicates otherwise. Can you talk a bit about this?
Yeah, great question. Yes, definitely the economy was more stable than it had been in the early part of the 20s, but also at this point, there's kind of a bubble that is going to burst in the stock market crash of 29. Regardless, Berlin at this particular moment is characterized by a very widespread inequality, and I think the depiction of the Charlotte character is one of the main ways that the show approaches that issue. I think, you know, the showrunners talked about one of the reasons why they were interested in this particular moment in German history, 1929, because when they started conceiving of making this show after 2008, they were really focusing on the resonances between the contemporary moment characterized by this vast inequality between the 1% and the rest. And looking back to 1929 as another time in German history that looked really similar to that. And as the show develops, this topic will develop much more prominently into a main strand of the narrative. We saw in the clip very briefly the character Alfred Nissen. He's played by Lars Eidinger, and he has the kind of stain on his face, and he's sitting up in the balcony of Mocha FD looking down at the performance. He develops into an important character. He is sort of based historically on Fritz Thyssen, the anti-communist industrialist who became a really important supporter of the Nazis later on. And Thyssen and Nissen in the show and his mother are these big capitalist industrialists, and their characters help to develop that sense of, you know, the very rich and the very poor that the show focuses on also through the Lotte character. So I do think that is portrayed in a very deliberate way, also to try to create resonances between the Weimar period and the present in that regard as well.
So I'm going to go and we have 4 more questions that I'll take you through. And I also have a question, but Andrew was able to get his question into the Q&A, and it was about the translation. not only maybe because he asked about the books being translated from German to English, but also maybe you could talk about the translation of the show from, especially if people watch the dub instead of the sub, or, you know, dub and sub, or whether they chose to watch it with German with English subtitles. There are certainly some things that, you know, if you understand German, you're going, well, that's not really what they say. But is there any, would you have anything to say about the way that they chose to translate it?
I think it's a great question. I have not listened to the dubbed version. I always turn on subtitles on Netflix. Some people don't know that you can do that pretty easily, and it's a great feature. I think the dubbing is not usually as good as listening to the original sound, and although I know for some people reading subtitles is a pain, but I think it's worth it for this show especially. I have to say that I don't look at the subtitles very much, so it's hard for me to say for sure how the translation is. I do notice that many things are left untranslated, and I think in a show that just has so much dialogue and so much sound design that's really interesting going on, it's probably hard for the translators to capture all of that in the English, but typically Netflix does a pretty good job, and I don't think that Netflix actually did the translations for this, so there's probably I think it was Sky TV initially that did the translations for this, so there's probably a lot of Britishisms in the translation, which for some US or North American viewers can be kind of irritating sometimes, but can help to explain why some of the translations seem to be the way they are sometimes.
And so Katrin has asked the question, can you say something about the portrayal of children in the show? She says it's very interesting how they're shown in the show, especially in the scene in the bar. And I think she's talking about where the girl is doing the tap and he does the cigarette trick for her and she laughs. But also, on that, I'm thinking of Lotta's little sister and how she's working in the Spinnerei or the Schneiderei, whichever one it was, and you know, instead of going to school.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about too much. I think the sister of Lotta, Toni, is an important character for registering the issues with education, especially education for girls at the time, and child labor. You know, Lotta, we haven't talked about that character so much. I wanted to sort of show with some of the images of the new woman in Weimar, Germany, how Lotta interestingly embodies kind of both sides of this discourse. She's trying to earn for her family as much as possible, and so she works as a precariously employed laborer for the police during the day, you know, sort of day labor or wage labor, trying to get some kind of more stable employment there. But by night she's a sex worker in the basement of Mocha FD, right? And one of the reasons why she's laboring constantly in all of these different ways is because she's trying to keep her little sister out of these exploitative child labor practices in the Spinnerei, and to keep her in school for as long as possible. So I think the depiction of children in the show, who are mostly girls, if I'm not mistaken, although in later seasons, there
was the little boy who runs up to Lotta and grabs her hand.
Oh yes,
they focus on.
Yes, and whom she kind of strictly
she's like,
takes off. Yeah. I mean, I think children are what? How can I put it? Quick ways of registering poverty and insecurity in the show, oftentimes, because you know, they're apparently innocent and shouldn't be subjected to this kind of plight, right? So I think the show does use them that way. Although in later seasons, I will say the political development of children becomes a big topic, and I think the show handles that also in really interesting, important ways that kind of problematize this assumption that children are innocent, and looks at their political agency in the development of Nazism, the rise of Nazism.
So David has asked a question. Do you have any sense of the Spanish flu pandemic and whether it shaped Berlin in the 20s. I know that there are like maybe 2 times where they reference Spanish flu in the first couple of episodes, and either somebody who died or something that had happened during that breakout. Do you have any?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really interesting. I do not know very much about that. It's not something that I have looked at or researched prior to this, and I would be very interested to know about it. I do know that the Spanish flu of 1918 was very widespread in Germany in general, and so I assume that it also had a pretty profound impact in Berlin. In the show, Gerrian Rath's mother had died of the Spanish flu in 1918. And part of the plot of the show revolves around the fact that Konrad Adenauer had helped their family because Rath's father is a police official in Cologne. So he was working together with Adenauer as a politician at the time, and Adenauer had, I guess, helped their family after the mother passed away. And that's one reason why Rath is now trying to pay back the favor by helping him with this blackmail. So it does. I thought it was interesting that it figures into the plot specifically, but I can't say too much more about it historically.
So my one question was just about like the way people move their bodies in this show, because you do talk about in your presentation about expressionist film and the way, like for instance, the Conrad Veidt movie where he can't control his hands, and the parallels between that and what you see in the show with Gerrion's trembling hands, and sort of the concepts that sort of were being developed around that time period of like alienation, and how you see alienation from the body, both through, being wounded in war, but also challenging gender norms and gender identity and sexuality, and the prominence of or prevalence of drug addiction, and all these different ways in which sort of the body is sort of in some kind of way a disconnect from what's going on in somebody's mind. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, just because at the end there with the Zu Asche zu Staub scene, I didn't even notice until this time about how oddly, what's their name, the performer? Nichols?
Nichols, yeah.
Yeah, so how oddly they move their body. It's not a graceful way that they're, in the background you've got this choreographed, Josephine Baker sort of situation, but they're, doing these odd claps over their hand that are kind of, you look at it and you're thinking, okay, that's, and it reminded me a little bit of the way, in Weimar silent films, the way people move, nobody just like walks across the room. They have to, do all of this, and, like there's a lot of like limbs going on and jerkiness. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the way that, or why people move that way all the time in sort of depictions of this era or stuff from this era.
Yeah, and I mean, I had to say season 3 of the show, without too many spoilers, really takes this topic up in even more interesting fashion. Season 3 is an adaptation of Kutscher's second novel, which is set in the UFA film studios. And there's a crime story that develops around a film set. So again, we have this really strong focus on film and photography, and the sort of backstage of filmmaking. And we see expressionist actors in the show, but then also the season plays with the idea of the Mensch-Maschine, the sort of human machine, which was this very prominent, aesthetic and cultural trope in the 1920s. And you can see this also in many films, also in literature at the time, and in kind of futurist political and artistic circles. This idea of the man machine or the human machine was constantly being discussed at the time. And I think that there's, I do think this question of the body and why the body is moving in this way has to do with modernity and with changing ideas about what a body is or might be that are happening in modernity, changing ideas that result in part from World War I and from the terrible injuries that resulted for so many people in the war, but also the use of modern medicine to create prostheses and to shape bodies with non-human parts in different kinds of ways at the time. I think it has to do with drug use also, which became very widespread in part to treat war wounds and what was known as shell shock or PTSD at the time, and which affected the way bodies moved, literally. But I think it also had to do with kineticism of modernity, with modern forms of transportation, and the idea that certain bodies could do sports, like women's bodies, for example, which had not really been allowed to do sports in quite that kinetic way in the past. So I think there's a lot of things that are changing about the way anatomy is understood, the way that human bodies are seen as machines or put into assemblage with machines at this time is really interesting. And I think the way that the show treats this topic is one of its intriguing aspects for me, in a lot of really subtle and then some not so subtle ways. But I think the movement of the Nikaros character in that dance scene is great. And there are all of these extended scenes of dancing throughout the series, again and again. And when we see Gary and Rat dance, for example, when he does this crazy kind of Charleston dance, it seems very unexpected for his character. And then we see many other characters dance again and again in all different kinds of contexts in ways that are very transgressive, also transgressive of gender norms and sexual norms, or that lead to or come out of forms of transgressing norms again and again in the show. And so that's certainly something that we could come back to talking about again later. I think it's a really interesting trope and topic.
Great. And I can also, so I think I was thinking, how would I put up together a list of sort of the things that you've referenced? And I can, one, put it into, so for everybody just listening, I can put a list of links and references that Hester and I have made into the Facebook event discussion. So if you're following the Goethe-Institut Washington on Facebook, you can find that event, and that's where I'll put it in the discussion section. And I can also send it out to the Eventbrite RSVPs. I know that not everybody here has RSVP to the Eventbrite, so that's why I'll do Eventbrite and Facebook, so that even if you're not on one, you can maybe see the other. But yeah, so that's about it for this evening. And I just wanted to thank Dr. Baer again so much for this awesome presentation and for fielding questions and talking Babylon Berlin season 1 episodes 1 and 2 with us. And we do really, we're so happy about the reception that we've gotten in terms of RSVPs, and we really look forward to hopefully continuing with season 1. And from the Goethe-Institut, at least on my end, I can say, I think that, we certainly are excited to continue our virtual programming with you all. So stay tuned to see if we continue this series and other programming that we have coming in the time of COVID, where we are all digital right now. So yeah, once again, we appreciate everybody being here with us this evening. Hester, do you want to say anything, or?
I'll just thank you all for your really interesting comments and questions, and I hope that we can do it again soon. And thank you, Raleigh, for organizing this. I'm very impressed. I think it went down technically without too much of a hitch, and that was great. So nice work.
I can breathe now. Thank you. And thank you all for coming. Have a great evening. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you all soon.
Bye, everyone.
Tschüss.